The storm of war, which had been building up since the end of World War I, broke on the 18th of September 1931, when Japan, inventing a provocation, invaded and annexed Manchuria, a province of China. Then, over the objections of the League of Nations, proclaimed the puppet state of Manchukuo. The natives, ever loyal to their emperor, Haile Selassie, fought with fanatical courage. Against them, Mussolini sent modern tanks, artillery, and planes, against which the primitive forces of Ethiopia were defenseless. Of Nations proved powerless to stop the naked aggression, and in 1937, using a manufactured provocation at the Marco Polo Bridge, the Japanese invaded China proper, and full-scale war breaks out in Asia. The world stands by while the Japanese army marches through the ancient land in a sweeping tide of conquest. Modern Air Force ravages the cities of China with merciless attacks. America slumbers on, blissfully relying on isolationism and neutrality to insulate her from the distant storm.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will. And all our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight.
We're not even awakened when the Japanese bombed the USS Panay, clearly marked American gunboat, on the Yangtze River, and 3 American sailors died. The Japanese apologize.
Wish to express their sincerest and profoundest regret to the American government and people on account of this deplorable incident.
The world holds its collective breath and gives a sigh of relief with the Munich Pact.
Without firing a shot or dropping a bomb, Hitler's military machine had won for him a great victory. But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain thought he had achieved peace. Peace in our time.
1939, and the fires of war in China were still raging. Half a world away, Czechoslovakia, dismembered by the Munich Pact, fell to Hitler without a battle. Hitler demanded that Poland surrender the Baltic seaport of Danzig with its strategic corridor to the sea, a prize lost by Germany in 1920 at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Poland did not yield. In defiance of British and French warnings, the Nazis, after making a secret non-aggression pact with Russia, invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, with their smashing blitzkrieg tactics. The heroic Poles fought the invaders with a courage that was phenomenal, but futile against overwhelming odds. The fiery curtain to Act One of World War II was raised. Britain and France declared war. The die was cast. Now British Prime Minister Chamberlain knew there would be no peace in our time. The United States proclaimed its neutrality, just as it had at the beginning of World War I. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean, it seemed, were still an ample safeguard for the immediate defense of our nation. In a cynical agreement, Germany and Russia had partitioned conquered Poland. Soon, Russia attacked Little Finland. The valiant Finns fought the Russians to a standoff. In China, the two Asian giants continued their struggle to the death. With the rest of the world exploding into violent war, the New York World's Fair opened to throngs of peaceful and pleasure-loving Americans. The wars in Europe and Asia were still far away. We read about them in the newspapers and watched the unfolding events in our newsreels. Again, as at the beginning of World War I, we had proclaimed our traditional neutrality. Millions of Americans were more interested in Joe DiMaggio and the New York Yankees taking 4 straight from Cincinnati in the World Series than they were in the deadly games being played in Europe and Asia, where aggressors were out to take all. In the grim international game of war, the aggressor teams were pitching and running the bases in what then looked like a shutout. But the World Series in that big league had yet to be played. 3 years before, General Douglas MacArthur had retired from active duty to become military advisor to the Philippines. Dwight D. Eisenhower, then a field grade officer, was a member of MacArthur's staff. By coincidence, General George C. Marshall was appointed Chief of Staff the same day the Nazis invaded Poland. Omar N. Bradley was a member of the War Department's General Staff. Leslie J. McNair was Executive Officer in the Office of the Chief of Field Artillery. George S. Patton, Jr., a colonel then, was Post Commander of Fort Myer in Virginia. Mark Clark was a member of the staff of the 3rd Division at Fort Lewis, Washington. Their Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, took the first step that was to make America the arsenal of democracy. In November 1939, Roosevelt signed a bill removing the Arms Embargo Act. Now we could supply the implements of war to England and France on a cash and carry basis. Full-scale Lend-Lease was still in the future, but our neutrality was starting to crack. The wheels of our industrial complex were beginning to turn. The slumbering, complacent giant among nations was awakening. Slowly, we began to increase our military manpower. The Army was authorized to recruit some 83,000 men. The Marine Corps, 10,000. The Navy, 42,000. But our combined military establishment was still less than 500,000 men. Hardly a token force in light of world events. Only a small handful of our forces was adequately equipped and partially trained for combat. In the spring of 1940, the Nazi war machine rolled into Denmark and into Norway. The gallant but small Norwegian army was forced to withdraw to last-ditch positions in the north. Holland was brutally crushed. In one deadly swoop, the Nazis overran Belgium, Luxembourg, and smashed across the French frontier. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war. The aggressors struck with massive air power. With armor, with mobile artillery. Strike fast, strike hard with overwhelming, ruthless force. Destroy entire cities, reduce them to ashes and rubble, along with the charred bones of their inferior civilian population. Show no mercy, Destroy the will to fight. Show them the hopelessness of resistance. Those were Hitler's orders. The British rushed in what combat-ready troops they had to try and help the French stem the German tidal wave that was sweeping the continent. In Britain, Winston Churchill, an indomitable man of the century, born of an English father and an American mother, took over the reins of government. In America, another great leader put before Congress and the nation the urgent need for defense.
These are ominous days. Security absolute.
The French army was fast disintegrating. British forces were saved from annihilation or capture by the miraculous evacuation at Dunkirk. Italy declared war against France and Britain. Paris, undefended, fell like a ripe plum into the Nazi basket of conquests. What remained of the French army retreated to Mediterranean ports for evacuation to North Africa, to live to fight another day and help win the victory. Hitler signed an armistice with France and became master of all Western Europe. He could now concentrate on the destruction of his greatest adversary, England. Only Britain, fighting for her life, and the Atlantic Ocean stood between the United States and what was then the most powerful conquering armed force the world had ever known. On the 1st of September 1940, in response to the growing peril, President Roosevelt called up 60,000 National Guardsmen from 26 states for 1 year's service. In the same month, for the third time in its history, Congress enacted a selective service bill. $16 million Americans registered for the draft. There were some who asked, why me? But the majority knew why. And despite any inner emotional conflicts, they responded in the same spirit as had their forefathers. They knew that the gutty men who made and preserved this nation never asked, why me? These were men who could look anyone in the eye and say, I'm proud to be an American and to serve my country in its time of need. From the cities, the towns, the villages, the farms, the plains and the mountains they came. Citizens from every walk of life, who would soon prove themselves to be soldiers in the finest traditions of the American fighting man. Within a year, our army grew to 1,500,000 men. It would continue to grow to a peak strength of 8 million. They had to be trained to combat hardness if they were to meet and destroy an enemy already toughened and blooded by combat. A new and mighty army was being forged along new lines to meet the challenge of improved enemy weapons, new tactics, new stratagems. At last, our top military leaders were being given the wherewithal to implement plans they had made for the defense of America under direction of George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. General Leslie McNair was charged with directing the gigantic training program. General Somervell was appointed Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of supply. His was to be a superhuman task. Dwight D. Eisenhower was to have a meeting with destiny. General Hap Arnold, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, stepped up the training of much-needed pilots. America was rising up out of the rut of her apathy. She was beginning to understand the hard fact that she was an integral part of the world. A world that suddenly had become one of violence and brutality. One in which America would have to fight to the death if she were to survive. While we were marshaling our resources, England was being given the bloodbath Hitler had promised. Britain's Royal Air Force fought night and day, taking a heavy toll of Nazi bombers, inspiring Winston Churchill's famous statement that never had so many owed so much to so few. Americans knew what would happen to the United States if Britain fell. Our response to the desperate plea for help came late, but not too late, in 1940.
It is the purpose of the nation to build now, with all possible speed, every machine and arsenal and factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
In North Africa, British forces were fighting an Italian drive upon Egypt. Nazi and fascist troops smashed into the Balkans, into Greece. The Greeks fought with their traditional courage, but were overwhelmed by the Nazi tidal wave. 1940 was a black year for what was left of the free world. 1941 was to be an even blacker year, during which the aggressors attacked the only two remaining major powers not yet at war, Russia and the United States. For the aggressors, it was to be the world or nothing. In June 1941, Hitler suddenly unleashed his forces against Soviet Russia. Sorely wounded, the Russian bear retreated, falling back before the onrushing Nazi legions. There was only one major power in the free world to go, the militarily weak United States. Now she stood alone. But how long could she stand? The Asian Axis partner thought she had an answer to that. One that would complete the aggressor's pattern for conquest of the entire world. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. A newly risen sun shone on beautiful Oahu. It was symbolic. It was the last time we were to be caught napping by a rising sun. The surprise attack was a staggering blow to our Navy at Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, I asked that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The immediate Japanese military objective was to knock out United States naval and air power in the Pacific in a single stroke. They reasoned that we were committed to eventual entrance in the war in Europe, convinced that we were incapable of fighting a two-front war. The Japanese were right in their calculations to the extent that Roosevelt and Churchill were to agree that the defeat of Hitler, the most powerful of our enemies, must have priority over an offensive against Japan. They followed sound principles of warfare. To engage the enemy were those already in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur, whose forces would fight not only that first battle, but after more than 3 long years of combat, the final battle against the last of the aggressors.
Three days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed on Luzon's north coast. The following day, still another Japanese landing was made on Luzon's east coast. On the 21st of December, the main Japanese invasion force hit the eastern shore of the Lingayen Gulf. Troops came pouring ashore from 80 transports. The Japanese onslaught gave General MacArthur only one choice: fight a delaying action, try to regroup his forces. It was a monumental task. The Japanese had struck swiftly, suddenly, devastatingly. They pressed forward, unchecked. To save Manila from war's destruction, General MacArthur declared it an open city. Ignoring such humanitarian consideration, the Japanese bombed Manila. On the last day of 1941, MacArthur withdrew to the mountainous terrain of the Bataan Peninsula, for Bataan and Corregidor commanded Manila Bay. The objective was to delay the enemy's entrance to the bay. MacArthur and his battling bastards of Bataan, as the troops in grim humor called themselves, knew they were fighting a losing battle. But they fought on, gaining precious time for us to recover from the disaster at Pearl Harbor and build up our forces. There were other prime targets marked by the Japanese. In December 1941, they took Hong Kong and invaded Malaya. They bombed British Singapore and its great naval base. The British fought back, but it was the same losing fight that our troops were waging in Bataan. On New Year's Day, 1942, the siege of Bataan began. Superior Japanese forces pounded our beleaguered troops for 3 long and agonizing months. On February 22nd, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and proceed to Australia as Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur turned over his command to General Jonathan Wainwright. Made the first leg of his journey to Australia by PT boat through enemy-infested waters. And then by plane from Mindanao. Bataan fell on the 9th of April, 1942. Thousands of captured American and Filipino prisoners of war began their infamous death march. Hundreds were to die, felled by exhaustion and by the bayonets of their captors. To those self-designated battling bastards of Bataan who starved and fought on, the nation owes a debt it can never repay. Theirs was a heroism seldom matched. Corregidor remained our last foothold. What once had seemed an impregnable rock fortress now awaited its inevitable doom. fortunes of the United States and its allies were at their lowest ebb. But the Japanese were soon to learn that their homeland was vulnerable to surprise attack. April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, prepared to take off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Their target, Tokyo, and 4 other major Japanese cities with carefully selected military targets. It was only 9 days after the fall of Bataan. Never before had such a carrier-based operation been attempted. The psychological effects of the raid on Tokyo were even greater than the material damage inflicted. It raised the morale of all Americans. It shocked the enemy into realization that we had the will and the wherewithal to carry the war to the heart of his own homeland. 3 weeks later, United States Navy planes of a carrier task force struck the Japanese fleet a damaging blow in the Coral Sea. The first naval battle in history to be fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft. While the Navy was starting to make a comeback, General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor. A proud old soldier who had fought in World War I, and who now at the age of 59 was surrendering his sword without cause for shame. For he and his men had fought in the finest tradition of the American fighting man. Our stubborn defense of Corregidor had put the Japanese conquest 4 months behind schedule and sent General Hama back to Japan, relieved of his command. In January of 1942, President Roosevelt had addressed Congress and the nation to set new and immediate production goals.
First, to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes. 10,000. 10,000, by the way, more than the goal that we set a year and a half ago. This includes 45,000 combat planes, bombers, dive bombers, pursuit planes. The rate of increase will be maintained, continued, so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Second, to increase our production rate of tanks so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 45,000 tanks, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 75,000 tanks. Third, to increase our production rate of anti-aircraft guns so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 20,000 of them, and to continue that increase so that next year 1943, we shall produce 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. And fourth, to increase our production rate of merchant ships so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall build 8 million deadweight tons, as compared with a 1941 completed production of 1,100,000.
Immense forces were mobilizing. Millions of Americans were in training. The infantry, airborne infantry, field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, armored cavalry, Army Air Corps pilots by the thousands. Woman power as well as manpower. The vitality of all America was surging up to full tide. American labor and management performed miracles. Planes, tanks, guns, ammunition. Tens of thousands of items rolled off the lines to supply not only ourselves, but our fighting allies. On the home front, 1942 was a momentous year. Great plans and stratagems were being laid and coordinated. Supplies by the millions of tons poured overseas. Nazi submarines took a heavy toll. Enough ships got through to help sustain our beleaguered allies. In the air, the tables were starting to turn. 1,000 Royal Air Force planes in a single massive saturation raid smashed Cologne, Germany. In the Pacific, our naval aircraft inflicted the first decisive defeat on a large Japanese fleet, winning the Battle of Midway. Triumph. There would be others, but they would be slow in coming.
Having gained a respite from attack in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, commander in the Southwest Pacific, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, were planning America's first offensive of the war. It would come in early August of 1942, when the Fighting Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, the first of many invasions of a Japanese-held island. There would be many more to come. In Europe, Canadian commandos tested the German defenses in the ill-fated raid on the French Channel port of Dieppe. The landing ended in disaster for the valiant Canadians, but the lessons learned will save thousands of lives in landings to come.
The first of our troops began arriving at overseas staging areas. In North Ireland, England, Australia, on bloody Guadalcanal, Army troops relieved battle-scarred and weary Marines to continue the fight for the Solomon Islands. The United States was demonstrating not only a will to fight, but the capability of fighting a two-front war against great odds on far-flung battlefronts half a world apart. On the 8th of November, 1942, American amphibious forces struck the shores of North Africa. We were, to use an appropriate American phrase, in business. The business of an all-out fight against powerful aggressors who had reached out to conquer the world. We had come thousands of miles, but not for conquest. In 1942, the commander of our ground forces, General Leslie McNair, said it best.
The United States is stretching out its arms to encircle the globe, not in conquest, but in protection. Even with our powerful allies, the task is vast and calls for our utmost all-out effort.
Our armed forces were encircling the earth in a mighty crusade for freedom. Nothing like it has happened in all of the history of man. It was the dynamic outpouring of a great nation's energy, blood, and resources to protect not only itself, but to liberate freedom-loving people everywhere. We had come a long way, but the end of the road was far from within sight. We had only just begun to fight. By winter 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, our fighting forces were building up fast and being deployed around the world, fighting beside Australian troops in New Guinea. And on Guadalcanal, where they had taken over from the long embattled Marines. large-scale amphibious landings had been made successfully in Africa. Joining up with the British in the fighting French. Other Army units were arriving in overseas staging areas in North Ireland, England, and Australia. As our combat and support forces began to encircle the globe, our lengthening supply lines were stretched to the utmost. An army cannot fight without food, clothing, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies and services, transportation, armor, and aircraft that must be constantly supplied with fuel and as constantly serviced, repaired, or replaced.
During the fighting of the vast stretches of arid desert land in North Africa, German General von Ravenstein, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, remarked that North Africa is a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. An American or Allied commander could very well have made the same statement.
On the other side of the world, in the Southwest Pacific, support for the combat troops was even more difficult in an entirely different kind of warfare. Logistics is the transportation, supply, and quartering of troops. Procurement of all required military equipment and materials, shipping and distributing cargo to the right place to arrive at the right time. In World War II, American military planners successfully solved the biggest logistics problems the world has ever known. Our lines of supply fanned out like a network around the world, extending northward to Alaska and the Aleutians, to the Panama Canal, westward across the Pacific to a chain of islands, on to China by way of India, to Burma, to Australia, eastward across the Atlantic to North Africa, the length of the Mediterranean, the Middle East and the southern route through the Persian Gulf, Russia, to Great Britain, Iceland, and to Russia by way of Murmansk in the far north, and ultimately the entire continent of Europe. Under Lend-Lease, we shipped to our allies approximately $25 billion worth of war material. These included approximately 850,000 pieces of equipment, tanks, locomotives, trucks, Free French forces in North Africa were supplied enough arms and material to equip 12 combat divisions. Millions of dollars worth of supplies went to China, flown there from India. To Russia alone, over the submarine-infested route to Murmansk, went almost 500,000 pieces of heavy equipment, railroad rolling stock, and clothing. Vast stores of munitions and equipment went to England and the Commonwealth. All this while we were supplying our own widely deployed forces and building mountains of supplies for the invasion of Europe yet to come. The miracle of supply achieved by the United States in World War II was unimaginable. It represented the outpouring of a great nation's energies and resources, not for conquest, but to win freedom for men who would be free everywhere.
Mighty America had come fully alive. A revitalized agriculture reached the largest food production goals in the history of mankind. Food not only for ourselves and our allies, but for the hungry populations of the countries our armies would liberate and occupy. Industrial output staggered the imagination, brought renewed hope to our hard-pressed allies, dismay and consternation to the aggressors. It amazed even ourselves. At long last, the United States had come of age, had found a vitality, a strength, and a will to do that was phenomenal in all the annals of men and nations. Great convoys of ships stretched out as far as the eye could see, carrying the millions of tons of cargo we kept pouring overseas. All of this in support of G.I. Joe. And who was G.I. Joe? He was the oft-times grimy, unshaven, heart and soul, blood and guts of America, the citizen soldier, the immortal image of the American fighting man whose forefathers had starved and frozen at Valley Forge to fight on and triumph at Yorktown, and again a few years later at the Battle of New Orleans. He had been a raw recruit at Bull Run, but emerged the victor at Gettysburg and the winner of a great and tragic civil war at Appomattox. He was the man who drove the enemy to defeat at Chateau Thierry, at Saint Mihiel and the Meuse Argonne. He was and is the American soldier personified. And who were his leaders? Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, Bradley, Patton, men who possessed the indomitable spirit and genius of Washington. Grant, Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing. This was the heritage of American military leadership in World War II, a heritage they could not and would not fail. Their one and only goal, victory. From buck privates to four-star generals, These were the priceless outpouring of America's greatest resource, the product of more than a century and a half of freedom, of democracy in action, of a great dream that their forefathers had fought for and made a reality, and which these, their sons, were fighting to preserve. But even amidst the tensions of war, there were precious hours of respite in which battle-weary men found rest and relaxation and brief moments of humor. But when they fought army. In bitter fighting, Nazi tanks hurled back Allied forces to the Algerian border. But then, combined American, British, and French units stopped the German-Italian drive at Kasserine and overran Tunisia. In the Pacific, on bloody Guadalcanal, fighting an entirely different kind of warfare, United States troops overcame the last fanatical Japanese resistance and won complete control of the island and its airfields. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Allied bombers sank 8 transports and 4 destroyers of a Japanese convoy of 16 ships. "181 days after the Allied landings in North Africa, Tunis and Bizerte fell before the drive of American, British, and French forces. The drive reached its full fury with lightning speed, in the air and on the ground. The enemy was hit, harder and harder, crushed in a fight from which there was no escape. In 5 days, all German resistance in Tunisia collapsed. The Axis forces surrendered. The myth of Hitler's super race was beginning to crack. In the faraway Aleutian Islands, American troops had landed on Attu. Still farther away in New Guinea, American and Australian troops drove back the stubborn and fanatical enemy in close fighting in malaria-infested jungle. Among the battle casualties we had suffered while fighting in the Buna area were 3 of our general officers, shot in action within less than 100 yards of the Japanese lines. From victories on the deserts of North Africa, the fog-bound Aleutians, to the tropical island of Guadalcanal and the New Guinea jungles, where our troops were driving forward against desperate Japanese resistance, we had indeed spread our forces around the world. Who was it that once said, the United States was incapable of fighting a two-front war? Within less than 16 months, the United States Navy had performed a miracle of salvage. Of all the ships sunk or damaged on December 7, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, all but 3 were back in service and in fighting trim by May 1943. An achievement on a scale unequaled in naval history. In Russia, the Germans had taken virtually all of Stalingrad by late 1942. Their conquest was short-lived. Early in 1943, the Russians launched a massive counterattack. Retook Stalingrad, destroying a Nazi army of 330,000. Capturing 17 of Hitler's generals. The tide had started to turn in Russia. In June of 1943, hundreds of Royal Air Force planes engaged in a non-stop aerial offensive over occupied Europe that continued unremittingly for 10 days. tide was turning in the air over Hitler's fortress Europe, American Army, Navy, and Air Forces, along with those of Australia and New Zealand, launched a concerted offensive to drive the Japanese out of New Guinea and the northern Solomon Islands. Enemy forces on Rendova Island were wiped out. Our troops drove for the Munda Airfield on New Georgia Island. With all of North Africa in Allied hands, preparations for Operation Husky were begun immediately to attack the soft underbelly of Europe. The immediate target, Sicily. Little time was lost. Only 60 days after the surrender of Axis forces in North Africa, Patton's 7th Army invaded Sicily simultaneously with British and Canadian troops under Montgomery. Some 3,000 craft were employed to land an initial force of 160,000 troops. Almost 14,000 vehicles, about 600 tanks, nearly 2,000 guns. But Sicily was held by more than 200,000 Italian and German troops, strongly entrenched on rugged terrain. It was to be a tough, hard-fought campaign.
In 1940, our Army numbered a little more than 250,000 men. Certainly, the veterans of the North African campaign learned that intensive training pays off, and now they were continuing to prove it in Sicily.
Our drive across Sicily was aimed at the key port of Messina, just across the narrow straits which separate Sicily from the toe of the Italian mainland. The Germans fought stubbornly, utilizing every defensive advantage offered by the rugged terrain. Italian forces offered little resistance. Patton's 7th American Army attacked from one side, while General Montgomery's 8th British Army pressed forward from the other. Citizen soldier G.I. Joe had fought and defeated the best the Nazi had to offer in North Africa and had taken the enemy's measure. was a veteran who had growing confidence in himself and in his leadership. He was a soldier. Whether he knew it or not, he was adding new glory to the traditions of the American fighting man. And at war's outcome, the word defeat had never been written on the scrolls of that fine tradition. In many areas, there was nothing more than a rut or a road. So units of the 7th Army did a little amphibious leapfrogging along the coast in their push for Messina. While our 7th Army pushed the Nazis across Sicily, in faraway New Guinea, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment made an airdrop at Nadzab, while American and Australian ground forces continued to press forward. Our growing air power made a daylight raid on military objectives in the heart of Italy with 500 bombers. On Sicily's north coast, Patton's 7th captured Palermo and drove on eastward toward Messina. In the air, 177 American B-24 bombers raided the oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania with 300 tons of explosives. Initiative no longer belonged to the Nazi fascist axis, in the air or on the ground. The ruthless drive for world conquest had been stopped all the way around the earth. From North Africa to the Pacific, where U.S. Army troops and Marines captured the Munda airfield on the island of New Georgia. On the same day our troops took Munda, Soviet forces smashed German defenses in central Russia. military targets on the Italian mainland were being mauled by our Air Force. Our ground forces were also hitting the enemy with devastating power. The crushing defeat suffered by the Axis in North Africa and Patton's advance toward the Straits of Messina were psychological poison to a badly shaken fascist regime. The once triumphant Caesar God, who had looked like this at the height of his power, when his fascist legions had slaughtered and conquered Ethiopian tribesmen who fought with spears and ancient guns, now looked like this. Mussolini had led his people through a nightmare of military disasters. His arrogant dictatorship had come to an end. Retributive justice was close at hand. The King of Italy ordered Marshal Pietro Badoglio to organize a new government and conduct secret negotiations for surrender. A separate peace by Italy was the last thing Hitler wanted. The collapse of Mussolini and his fascist regime brought additional German forces pouring into Italy. From fighting ally, the Nazi was now the unwelcome intruder who would wage his battles of fierce resistance on Italian soil, bringing further ruin and suffering to an exhausted and war-sick people. On the 17th of August, 1943, 38 days after the invasion began, Patton's 7th Army took Messina, and all Sicily was in Allied hands. As well as 100,000 Italian prisoners. Most of the Nazis had escaped to the mainland across the Straits of Messina. "11 days after the fall of Sicily, Allied headquarters in the Pacific announced the end of all Japanese resistance on New Georgia Island. General MacArthur's forces were starting on the road back. We had already begun our island hopping in the Central Solomons. But the battle for Nazi-held Italy was only beginning. On the 3rd of September, 2 British divisions crossed the Straits of Messina to land on the toe of the Italian boot. Six days later, American forces struck the beach at Salerno, 30 miles south of Naples. They met stiff enemy resistance. 4 days after the landings, the hurriedly reinforced enemy launched a strong counterattack, pouring in some of its best troops. For a time, our foothold was precarious. But supported by a concentration of combined firepower from aircraft, naval guns, and artillery, the Allies held the beachhead. The heavy pounding by land, sea, and air was too much for the Nazis. They fell back as our own forces pushed on toward Naples. By then, Italy had surrendered unconditionally, was officially out of the war. October 1st, 1943. Elements of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army entered the city of Naples. They were greeted not as conquerors, but as liberators. The citizens of Naples knew that we and our allies were the only hope of driving the Germans from their homeland. Here, as elsewhere, a new problem confronted our invasion forces: how to provide government for the civilian population. Years of fascism had promised plenty, but delivered only strife and hunger. Unless such centers of hungry population along a route of advance are well controlled, the advance is hampered. Communications break down, supply channels clog up. In Naples, the Allies met the challenge and thwarted chaos. The Naples water supply presented another challenge to the Allied forces. This problem was also mastered. Military government was a necessity, one which also had a direct influence on post-war rehabilitation throughout Europe. Following the fall of Naples, we expected our advance to continue. It did, but only for a brief period. The mountainous regions of central Italy provided the Germans with a number of natural defense lines. These, together with the closing in of the Italian winter, virtually stopped our forces in their tracks, scarcely 80 miles from Rome. While our fighting men in Italy were faced with a veritable stalemate, an entirely different kind of war was going on in the faraway Pacific, where Allied forces landed on Mono and Sterling Islands in a campaign launched to drive the Japanese from Bougainville. We invaded the Gilbert Islands. The 2nd Marine Division took Tarawa after 76 hours of bloody fighting. Heavy casualties were suffered. But the Japanese were wiped out. Elements of the Army's 27th Infantry Division took Macon and the neighboring atoll. Our Army Air Corps was engaged in massive bombing of the industrial heart of Germany, devastating Nazi plants and marshalling yards. But the Nazis' Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, had yet to come. The bitterest of large-scale battles had yet to be fought, and some of these were soon to come on the Italian front, where strong defensive positions were held by a tough and stubborn enemy. That and the weather had bogged down our advance. It was winter 1943. The stage was set for the Cairo-Tehran talks. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek at Cairo. Even at the moment fighting was most intense in Italy, high-level master plans continued to be made for the invasion of France and for other Allied operations throughout the world. At Cairo, talks centered on the relation of European operations to the war in the Pacific. From Cairo, Roosevelt and Churchill flew to Tehran, where for the first time during the war, they met with Marshal Stalin, dictator of Soviet Russia. The Allied leaders failed to agree on everything, but one thing they did agree upon was that the invasion of Normandy in southern France must and would take place sometime during the following summer of 1944. For some time, there had been doubt as to who would command Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Roosevelt, en route home from Tehran, stopped off at Tunis to see General Eisenhower and to tell him that he was to command Overlord. The grand design for victory in Europe was now completed. But so far as the Allies in Italy were concerned, France and the cross-channel invasion were a long way off. It was to be a tragically long winter of hard fighting in Italy. There was the battle for Monte Cassino. To bypass the mountainous terrain holding up our advance in southern Italy, forces made an amphibious landing at Anzio, only 35 miles south of Rome. Heavy Nazi resistance stalled the breakout from the beaches. Finally, we blasted our way out of the pocket. The landings at Anzio convinced Hitler that we were launching an all-out campaign in Italy. He rushed 8 more divisions to reinforce his army in Italy, and the stalemate was resumed.
In the Pacific, Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands is taken by an amphibious force as our advance in the Central Pacific continues.